Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of Artists in Process, presented by the Allentown Art Museum. My name is Abby, and I'm the Adult and College Program Coordinator at the museum, and I'm so excited to be here tonight with artist Richard Killeaney. Richard Killeaney was raised in San Diego, California. He received his BA in Studio Art and French from Hobart College and a Textiles MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. He has taught textile design to fashion and interior design students at the Pratt Institute, Rodale Island School of Design, Moore College of Art and Design, and Fairfield University. Exhibitions include the New Britain Museum of Art, Shelf House Gallery in Bridgeport University, and a solo show at the New Haven Museum. He has been featured in Natural Home Magazine, Connecticut Cottages and Gardens, and Quilt Folk. He currently lives in up-and-coming Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he works on Ochiltree Design, his own line of quilts, pillows, and repurposed leather accessories. Ochiltree Design, named after Richard's great-great-grandmother's maiden name, pushes the idea that green designs can truly transform repurposed materials into sophisticated goods. The line takes inspiration from the Southern California coast and other places Richard has visited. The quilts, pillows, and leather goods are manufactured in Connecticut at a quality to withstand daily use and become heirloom pieces. Many of the fabrics used in the quilts and pillows are sourced from discarded apparel. When new fabrics are used, they are organic, prioritizing USA-made goods. All of the leather used for the totes and handbags are repurposed from used apparel sources, discarded leather samples, or post-production leather scrap. The larger goal of Ochiltree Design is to find beauty and sustainability in reuse. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Richard. We're so glad to have you. So tonight we'll have lots of opportunities to ask questions throughout the program. So I encourage anyone and everyone, if you have a question along the way, just post it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And just before we dive into the program tonight and get to know Richard's process and his work a little bit better, I want to speak a bit about the exhibition which inspired tonight's focus on quilting and textile arts. We currently have two exhibitions up that sort of touch a little bit on tonight's themes. The first exhibition is called Sleep Tight. Sleep Tight features outstanding bed covers and bed curtains from the museum's collection. Historically, textiles for the bed were among the most valuable goods in the home. Their large scale demanded hours of work, but also offered a canvas for remarkable creativity. This exhibition brings together textile masterpieces, such as embroidered Suzanis from Central Asia, hand-painted Japanese futon covers, and Pennsylvania German quilts, some of which have never been shown at the museum before. Through a global selection of works, Sleep Tight explores how community, trade, and migration all play a role in shaping traditions. Sleep Tight is supported through the generosity of the Bernard and Audrey Berman Foundation and the Leon C. and June W. Holt Endowment. We have another exhibition, like I said, that touches on tonight's themes. And that exhibition is called Roots. So what happens when a particular community and its creative works come into contact with the mainstream art world? Roots examines this process and its aftermath, revealing hidden layers of meaning behind iconic American aesthetics. The exhibition includes works by Plains and Northwest Coast Native Americans, the artists of G. Bend, Alabama, an African-American community known for their abstract quilts, and the Shakers, a religious sect that made furniture expressing their values of simplicity and order. These works will be displayed alongside the art and design inspired by these traditions. Through these case studies, Roots raises important questions about inspiration, appropriation, and identity. This is one in a series of American art exhibitions created through a multi-year, multi-institutional partnership formed by the Philadelphia Museum of Art as part of the Art Bridges Initiative. The exhibition program at the museum is supported through the generosity of the Bernard and Audrey Berman Foundation and through the Leon C. and June W. Holt Endowment. Thank you to all of our supporters, Art Bridges, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, for all of their support for these exhibitions and programming. So without further ado, Richard, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to you so that you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your practice, and your works.
I was muted. Great. Thank you so much, Abby. That was a terrific introduction. And I'm so honored to be a part of this. The history of bedding and bed dressing generally is something that I'm really passionate about. And I think of myself first and foremost as a textile designer. So all things fabric fire me up. So let me go ahead and get my presentation up for you.
While you're doing that, Richard, I just want to remind everyone one more time, if a question pops into your head at any point along the way, just drop those questions in the Q&A and we'll get to those as soon as Richard finishes with his presentation.
All right, thank you again, Abby. So my business, I titled it Ochiltree Design. It really was sort of fashion inspired when I started this. I was thinking about various fashion designers who had honored their mothers and grandmothers by naming their business after their maiden name. It was sort of a happy accident that despite the fact that no one can pronounce Ochiltree, it means that it's very easy to Google my business. So things to think about. The very first quilt I designed was this one, which I call Missing the Point. And it was designed back in 2003 as a part of my master's thesis project at the Rhode Island School of Design in the textiles program. This started with a project prompt where we were instructed to make something that was recycled and or sort of technologically driven. And I chose to go with something recycled. I've always been a major thrift store shopper. And so in starting this, I kind of went to the thrift stores and asked myself, all right, what is there in abundance? And across America, but specifically here in New England, men's blue and white dress shirts are abundant. Am I at the beginning? I am. Okay. I'm going to show you quite a few quilts that I have here first, and then we'll get more deeply into the process. This is the same quilt, as you can see, but in a different coloration. These quilts are made entirely using men's dress shirts. And some of the pieces have been overdyed using natural dyes, like Osage orange, black tea, and walnut husks. This third quilt is also inspired by architecture out west. This quilt specifically is inspired by this unusual Western 1970s architectural thing called weeping mortar, which is the idea that you're so rich you can afford to have the mortar weep out of the bricks in your house. And so I started there and then played with different blue and white striped shirts to create this pattern, thinking again about bricks. This quilt I titled Golden State and was thinking about the light in California. This piece was entirely designed thinking about recycled paper. So a lot of my quilts, and you'll see that in future slides, the process starts with making collages using vintage and recycled papers, and then color matching to fabrics that are also recycled. Sometimes it's just pattern driven. This quilt, there isn't any special crazy inspiration, but I was thinking about how can I get the most amount of fabric out of a man's dress shirt. So this quilt, which focuses on the progression of colors, each one of those zigzags across the quilt is made out of one single dress shirt. So there are, I think, 13 men's dress shirts featured in that particular quilt. I 5 years ago was on an incredible artist residency in northern Iceland. This piece was made while I was there. I brought the men's dress shirts with me, which was a good thing because in Iceland, they do not throw away the volume of clothing that we do in the United States. So that would have really changed my process. I did buy this ivory fabric while I was there. This quilt was inspired by grasses in the snow in Iceland. And another piece from the Iceland period. Again, all of these pieces were color matched before I left the United States because I needed to bring my materials with me to work with while I was there. And then I developed the pattern and sewed this while I was in northern Iceland. It was a small town called Blönduós. This is the same quilt in a different coloration. So one of the things that I think about my training as a textile designer is always to think about taking a single pattern and reinterpreting it. And I think that we as quilters are particularly good at that. We always take a single pattern and think, how can we reinterpret it? So you can see what a difference it makes when the whole quilt is blue on blue versus when the whole background becomes a single color and then the triangles are really the focus. So to show you a little bit about my process, because I have an MFA in textile design, but my background is as a painter. I'm really focused on kind of looking at actual things and pulling my inspiration from that. So I grew up in San Diego, and my mom grew up in Point Loma. And Point Loma is this unusual peninsula in San Diego that juts out into San Diego Bay. So one side of Point Loma is actually the ocean, and then the flip side is all the bay. This is kind of the stereotypical postcard view of San Diego Bay with the yacht club. The dock that you can just see in the foreground is my sort of surrogate grandmother's dock. And so I spent every 4th of July, Memorial Day, Labor Day, and every Christmas there. Everyone always says, well, you know, what do you do with no snow and Christmas? Well, you go outside and you play with your new toys. So this was a major part of my childhood. And I love this picture of the Cabrillo Monument overlooking the bay and the Coronado Bay Bridge, where you can see the striations in the water. And so all of these things became inspiration for that first quilt. So when I was developing that very first quilt, I didn't just jump in. This is the sort of 1-week homework assignment I did in 2002, where I had overdyed some samples. I was still leaving the buttons in, and I just sewed a little sample to get feedback from my professors. I tried different variations. This one's sort of thinking a little bit more about piano keys and focusing on light and dark distribution. This is how this process actually works. So when you cut a dress shirt apart, I really try to take the pieces as they come. And so the sleeve yields different sized pieces than the front and the back of the shirt. I always arrange things like I would a palette as a painter. And so I organize things by value, as you can see, from dark to light. And I also think about sort of the stripes and the way they distribute themselves. Many of these quilts I make on my Singer Featherweight. I have a Singer Featherweight sewing machine that I received in high school. My dad bought it for me at a garage sale. Featherweights are beloved by quilters because of the fact that they're eminently portable and they sew straight lines consistently. So I do a lot of my actual quilting on this machine, even though I have industrial machines today. This is what the layout looks like. And then this picture is fuzzy because it's from a very old cell phone of mine, but I sew all the strips together, and each of these strips is individual. And then I lay them out on my studio floor, and I go stand up on my loft, and I look over the top, and I take a picture to see, do I like the way the lights and the darks are moving through the quilt? So the patchwork is really random, but this is the only part where I really kind of design the way it's going to look overall. And I always test them in black and white. This goes back to my art school education and thinking about value. I try to make sure that my distribution of values from lightest to darkest really works and creates that flow that I want. This is that same quilt sewn together. So this is a queen size version that I made in 2006. I've made this quilt numerous times. Here's another version of it made as a twin. This one does not feature overdyed strips. This was made for a client who bought this for her infant son and decided better to get a twin that he could grow into. And here it is again as a king size quilt. This was a remembrance version. So this was made in memory of a dear friend's husband who had died. She commissioned this to remember him. And you can see again, it features the overdyed pieces. And in this quilt, they're done using tea and black walnut husks. This is the same quilt done in a red version. So again, I always try to look at things in different colorations. And you can see I do leave here, this is actually a pocket from the front of the shirt. And this is one of the printed labels from the shirt tails of the quilt. In terms of repurposing, this really launched me off into repurposing everything. So when I'm in my thrift store, I always ask myself, well, what is there a lot of? And there are a lot of really unfortunate leather pieces that might have holes or stains or buckles and pleats. This is a pair of cherry red 1980s pleated leather pants. I'm sure somebody wants them, but I choose to buy these and turn them into new things. So the first thing is to take them apart, cut out the stains. I often wash the leather. This is what it looks like when I start to cut the pieces apart to make the component parts to make a tote bag. This is my industrial Union Special overlock machine that I use to finish all my seams, probably built in the 1960s, and I don't think they've made anything better since. And this is what the finished tote bags look like hanging on the staircase in my studio. So one of the purposes of my business is to not make things that look inherently recycled. I want to focus on the quality of the materials and really transform them to make them feel truly modern, and that you're buying a beautiful new object that just happens to be made bringing no new materials into the world. The tote bags have been incredibly popular for me. I make them in a variety of different shapes and sizes. It's really nice to go to a craft show. And while I love making the quilts most, it's great to have lesser price items. And for me, sewing is sewing, and I love making anything. This is what I've been doing with my leather scraps. I try not to throw anything away. So you can see my inspiration wall there, which has everything from the artist Nick Cave to a grandmother wearing some Vivienne Westwood clothing. All these little squares are all collected different black leathers that give it this sense of depth, but also allow me to use up the little scraps that would otherwise maybe be considered trash. And again, really thinking about how can I transform these materials to make something that feels really new. Inspiration is also really tricky and exciting. So I was asked 2 years ago by a curator in Connecticut to create a small show for this house. This is located in New Haven. The New Haven Museum owns this house. It's called the Pardee Morris House. And the Morris House was originally built, well, the foundations date back to the 1600s. This version was built in the 1700s. And then it was subsequently burned by the British after the Revolutionary War as they went up and down the New England coast and ransacked things. One of the cool parts about this house is that we have really detailed manifests of the valuables in the house, which included things titled bed rugs, everything from bed rugs to spoons, but quilts. And the house is very, very Spartan, as one would expect of a house from the 18th century in Connecticut. I struggled when I visited this house to sort of focus on what inspired me in terms of making quilts. And the little gallery I was in was not capable of handling a full-size quilt. The largest wall space was only 40 inches wide. One thing I really loved with the floorboards, it has these unusually wide, but characteristic of the era, wide plank pine boards. And so I immediately started making collages. I mentioned I do collages as a way to develop my quilt patterns. And so this particular collage is made entirely using recycled paper. And in this case, these are security envelopes. So the envelopes that deliver your bills, as kind of trying to make a connection there between sort of the value of the items in the house and the way that sort of commerce works generally. And I made a couple different versions of this. This one focused on the cracks in the floor. I didn't love that version. This one, I really wanted to showcase all the different patterns that show up in security envelopes. And so ultimately the goal of this is that this collage is done at the scale to become a queen size quilt. So what I do is I trace these out or do the math, and then I'm able to turn, this is basically 12 inches by 13 inches, and turn it into a full size quilt. So here it is as a queen size quilt. Now the pattern is not identical because the size of these pieces of paper depends on the size of the envelope. The size of these pieces of fabric depended on the shirt itself. So I'm really working with things as they come. And the best thing I did here, well, the best I could do was to color match, to trying to get the grays correct. I purposely put the plant in there because otherwise people have a hard time telling the difference in the scale. There you can see a little bit better the sort of the prints that were involved in this, some plaids, some dobbies, some polka dots. The next thing I was looking at was the windows, and I initially tried to be very direct in taking inspiration from the windows. I was obsessed with this fluorescent pink copy paper. This is brown craft paper. Again, I'm really looking at using the papers that surround us in our everyday lives. Playing with different scales. Again, as a quilter, this is something I think about a lot. So these stripes, you know, are every inch. These are every, I think, 1/3 of an inch. I was liking the color. This was the windows. I was not liking it as a quilt pattern. It wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. And so this is when, you know, you do the sketch, you look at it, you try to get some help from your friends. And then I made the connection that I've also always been obsessed with mail circulars. The artwork, the layout, everything about them, I'm sort of obsessed. And so I took mail circulars that I had and used those as proxy for both the commerce of the house and the window frames. And so if you look at the grid is really dependent on the size of this Listerine mouthwash and those vitamins and all of these things. it's really kind of random. So I traced the grid onto the paper and then filled it in with my paper. And so these are what various collages look like using the grid and putting the paper over the top. And so this is how I went from the windows in the building to these patterns. I tried a lot of different versions, some that had very large open areas, some that were sort of medium. This one is kind of the most crowded. And ultimately, I also flipped the color. So again, doing it on brown paper with fluorescent pink, and then doing it on kind of this lovely off-white, which was an old grocery bag with the little blue mail envelopes. I did take this particular collage. It's the first one. This show only happened 2 years ago, so I'm in process of making these larger. And there's that actual quilt at full scale. So you can see how I go from collage to quilt. And I actually use Adobe Illustrator to create the patterns. In the detail, you can see that actually the blues are not consistent. They do change exactly the same as they do in the collage. So there we go. That's kind of an introduction to my work. I have more slides if you're interested in looking. Right now, my website is a work in progress. However, I frequently post process photos and photos of my work on my Instagram. So if you're interested in seeing more of what I'm doing, Occultree Design is my Instagram handle.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. That was really insightful and telling. We've actually got some questions in already, and our very first question that we got is actually going to take you back further even than your PowerPoint. And the first question is, when did you become interested in textiles and more specifically in quilting?
All right. Yeah, this is sort of a point of mythology at this point in my life. So my third grade teacher, Mrs. Ritchie, taught the whole class needlepoint stitches. I want to say 20 or 30 different stitches. So at 8 years old, I was doing needlepoint. I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. And so I knew that boys were not supposed to be doing needlepoint. So I kept doing it and just didn't tell any of my friends, and was really lucky that in San Diego, there were incredible craft stores that were super, super supportive of me. So I spent a lot of time at a craft shop called Craft Corner. It was in a strip mall. I could ride my bicycle there by myself. When my family moved, when I was 14, there was another craft store in the area called Cruel World. There's a pun there. And the owner of Cruel World, her name will come to me, but she was Native American. And so she sold Native American memorabilia and yarns. And I started knitting. She helped me with my knitting, as did my mom. And then the next thing was I discovered quilting when I turned 15, because my grandmother used to show me antique quilts and say, if you learn more about this, I'll give it to you. So I learned about quilting because I wanted the quilts. And I spent my quilting, I started quilting at 15 via the Country Loft in San Diego, which I do think is still there. My mentor at that shop was Susan Plack, who at that time was a very well-known quilter. She specialized in kind of modern colorized versions of Baltimore album quilts, and was very involved in the Visions Art of the Quilt exhibitions that happened in the 90s in San Diego. So the Country Loft and Cruel World were really instrumental in kind of supporting my early fiber works. And I was never, ever treated as a 15-year-old boy there. I was going to stitch and bitch sessions by myself when I was 16, and was sitting there listening as all the middle-aged women described the troubles with their husbands. And I just nodded along and kept quilting.
Oh, that's so funny to imagine. Since you're mentioning, like, being surrounded by women in your work, historically quilting has been considered like women's work, quote unquote. So can you tell us a little bit about how this has played into your experience and your practice as a textile artist?
Yeah, I mean, I feel really blessed and happy that I did find the level of acceptance that I did. It was really terrific. I didn't have male inspiration. I didn't have mentors in that sense that were there to sort of guide me along the way. And for me, aesthetics always kind of took precedent over everything else. Being a guy, I don't know, I did have math teachers that were influential. My earliest quilt that I designed for myself to take to college when I was 18 was very based on MC Escher, of whom I was obsessed at the time. And by the time I was in graduate school, that was when I was really kind of figuring out my sexuality and that I was gay, and sort of sorting through those things and sorting through what it meant to be a Californian living in the East Coast. So my master's thesis is where I really kind of explicitly explored the ideas of sexuality, class, gender, all of that. You know, I mean, the blue and white quilts are pretty, but there is a big part of it to me where the blue and white shirt for me symbolizes the patriarchy. You know, when we think about a man in a suit going to work on Wall Street or any sort of corporate job, I do find those shirts to be proxy for that. So while I love them as a material to chop up, I don't choose to wear them myself.
Oh, that's so fascinating. That's so interesting. We've got another question here from Caroline. She said, what about quilting is most interesting to you? Why quilting over painting or drawing, for example?
Yeah, it's funny because I have a background in painting and drawing, and I do still sketch. When I go abroad, like when I was in Iceland and had to create a quilt pattern, I go back to my roots, which is I sketch. I draw from nature and what I see, but then it goes into quilting. I think I'm happy that I'm lucky that I was able to discover very early the format that makes me happy. Like I know how to knit, I know how to weave. Those are not the sort of, you know, I feel like all of us are interested in a certain tedious thing. And for me, it's patchwork. I really love it. I really love hand stitching, and I'm excited for when I'm 70 and have more time to do it. Right now, I don't spend a lot of time doing handwork, but later it'll happen.
Later. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting, Richard, that you showed us in your process that you're not only doing the drawing and sketching, but you're also doing collaging and your pattern making essentially before you actually do any part of like the actual quilt making and sewing. So we have another question, I think, that ties into that says, what is the most difficult material for you to repurpose, whether it's your collages or your quilts or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the first quilt I made for my thesis, I bought blue and white shirts I bought them for color without thinking about anything else. And many of the shirts were 50-50 cotton poly. And the number one thing I discovered is I don't want to have to deal with changing the temperature on my iron. The 50-50 cotton ones would burn, they'd scorch. And that quilt, which is on my bed to this day and is now falling apart all these years later, the polyester blended cotton shirts have deteriorated, where the cotton ones have held together. So I now only use 100% cotton shirts for recycling, just because of the ironing thing.
Yeah.
Leather is really fun to work with, and I've taught myself. I don't have a background in leather sewing, so I've learned as I've gone along. Many of you are probably interested to know, like, you can't iron leather. So when you sew a seam together, you either have to pound it open with a hammer, and you either use double-sided tape or glue. So that's kind of a weird difference when you do any sort of patchwork with leather. Because I'm using lots of different types of leather, that is challenging, because different weights and styles of leather behave differently in the machines. Some of them stretch a lot, some don't stretch at all. So that can be hard.
How do you balance that, having these materials that sometimes have different properties and things going on with them as you're using so many repurposed materials?
Practice and a lot of technique samples. So again, things that I got from art school. You know, I teach fashion students as well, specifically sewing, and technique samples. Like, I've learned my lesson. If you try to make the thing the first time to have it be something you can sell or use, it will fail. It is almost impossible for you to make something new from the get-go and have it work. So lots and lots and lots of technique samples. And if that's leather, that means making little squares where I try different variations. Sometimes I have to have muslin on the back of the leather so that the multiple layers don't stretch against themselves. If I'm doing a new quilting technique, like particularly, I avoid Y seams, but the first quilt I ever made had a Y seam. Any of you that do quilting know that they're hard. They're really hard. And I had to do a lot of samples to get the Y seam to work.
Yeah, I think I've heard that from almost every artist I've ever spoken with. It's all about experimentation and trying new things, which I think is awesome and amazing. We have another question here from Amanda. It says, would you consider quilting craft or design? Is there a difference in your mind between those two things? I
knew someone was going to go there. I made a decision when I started my business to think about quilting as a design because I wanted to be able to make multiples and I wanted to be able to sell them. And to me, when you make something functional that's made in multiples, that gears it a lot more towards design. And I think there's room there for high design. You know, we see designers that make, you know, $20,000 chairs where they only make 10 of them. And maybe, you know, you never sit in it or it ends up in a museum. But I do think because I have done fine art, my process for fine art is maybe a little bit different than that. I think I missed the rest of the question.
Is there a different, it asks if there's a difference between craft and design in your mind when it comes to quilting?
No, I don't think there's a difference in craft and design, unless you're talking about craft from the point of view of like craftsmanship. So I do make a big effort to have the quality of the way I make things to be very, very high. That's one of, I think, the signatures of my work, is to make sure that the seams line up, that things are very structurally stable. I want to make things that last a long time, because when I think about recycling and repurposing and this and that, like, I would rather buy one pair of shoes I wear for 10 years than have to have a new pair of shoes every year.
That brings up, honestly, a really important topic that we've seen, you know, surfacing in the past like 5 to 10 years, the importance of sustainability in throughout industries, not just in art and design, but throughout lots of different organizations in different fields. And you've already spoken quite a bit about how you reuse things that you're finding that have been discarded. So can you tell us a little bit more about how sustainability plays a role in your practice and why that's so important to you as an artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this goes back to just being, you know, a teenager in the 90s when Earth Day was like really kind of trendy and popular. And I feel like that was a movement that I kind of latched onto. I became vegetarian in college. I'm now pescatarian, but you know, I've always kind of thought about those things. And as an adult, when you're no longer actively involved in college, I think it's difficult to think of yourself as an activist. And I'd like at heart to think I'm an activist, but I don't always know how one manifests that if you're not out actively working for a nonprofit or protesting every day. And so I think the manner by which we are consumers can make an impact. And if it doesn't make an impact, I mean, I've heard arguments about this. It gives me a focus and a way to make decisions. So I like the fact that because I use recycled materials or organic materials, it gives me a limit. I don't have the 500 colors that would be available otherwise. I do want to show an image of my first quilt because it does bring back something that's really interesting about designing with repurposed materials versus new. So anyone that works with solid fabrics knows, like, I think Robert Kaufman's Kona line has maybe 140, 150 colors. Correct me if I got that wrong, and within that, there might be 10 blues. So you've got 10 blues commercially available in the marketplace. But the quilts I'm making sometimes have 25 different blues. So I'm also excited about the fact that because I'm recycling, I'm able to integrate more colors with more color diversity than what is commercially available in the marketplace. Wow. And the very first quilt I made with those horrible Y seams, because I was 18 and didn't know any better, this was the first quilt I ever made. Wow. And there's 3 colors in it, but you can't see them. And I'll explain why. So there's the yellow.
This is your first quilt ever?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. You're like a prodigy. That's such an...
Well, my mom took me to Target and they had a quilt that was a comforter that was orange and purple, which strangely are the colors of Hobart College. And then I was like, well, it's ugly. I don't want to buy it. So I designed this and made this before I left for college. At the time, I was obsessed with red, orange, and yellow with purple. So this is actually a Hoffman Celestial that anyone will remember from 1993. So it's red, orange, and yellow. However, I had to have my mom help me with this in the store. At that time, there were no commercially made prints in orange. So what you're actually seeing is a super duper cherry red with kind of a tomato red. And that was like the best I could do in that store because orange, the woman in the store told me, she's like, we only have orange fabrics at Halloween. And so, you know, I was really limited by what was available in the marketplace. And so yeah, this quilt is now hanging in my mom and dad's house. They like it.
Wow.
So for me, repurposing also is a way for me to get more colors, you know, and also knocking things off because I work in fashion. I think about that as well. Like it It's not impossible, but it is pretty hard if you're using new commercially made fabrics. To get 25 different blue and white stripes would be a big expense.
Oh yeah, definitely. So out of curiosity, Richard, you've spoken about how you go the extra length to make sure that your works are high quality and sustainable, are going to last a lifetime. And you also talked about how you have to do a lot of experimenting because you have such a variety of fabrics at your studio. How long does it generally take to create like a twin or, you know, queen size quilt or one of your handbags?
Yeah, so the quilt that's behind me, I'll hold it up in a second. That's missing the point, that first quilt I designed. And because I've made that one 4 or 5 times now, I've timed myself and have a really good sense. So if you ignore the design thing, if you say, all right, I've got the pattern all worked out, the math is all worked out, that quilt, if I'm rushing, I can get the patchwork done in about 24 hours.
Wow.
And then it usually takes me about an hour to an hour and a half to make a back. And I know everyone's wondering, I choose to outsource my quilts to someone that has a very expensive Gamma long arm quilting machine because I don't do artistic quilting. This quilt is simply quilted in the ditch, and she can do it at a higher quality than I'd be able to do on my own. And then I do like to do a hand sewn binding, which takes me queen size quilts, maybe 5 hours. So, you know, you're looking at about 30 hours.
Wow.
Labor.
That's just the labor side of it's not even the design process. And I know that's
right.
a pretty big chunk of time.
Yeah.
I have another question for you, Richard. You talked a little bit about activism and how being an activist is kind of like a gray area, but I'm curious if you have used your quilts and used your artistic practice as a form of activism in the past. Like, I love that you mentioned that a lot of the shirts that you buy are men's shirt and they represent the patriarchy for you. And it's so interesting, the idea of putting the patriarchy onto a quilt, which is traditionally like women's work, like we talked about before. Could you talk a little bit more about that and some of the ideas that are floating around in your head as you're making these incredible quilts?
I mean, I think of myself as a designer. I like sewing. I like making pretty things, and I love that other people like them. I don't think that my quilting necessarily represents an overt sense of activism. I think that's a lot to ask of a quilt. I know that there are quilters out there that do image-based quilts. I'm thinking specifically of like Bisa Butler, who's really just ascendant right now. I think it'd be easier to talk about her quilts in that way, although I think her quilts kind of push up against our traditional ideas of what a painting can be. Yeah, I don't think there's any heavy activism. I think for me, like, it's my own personal politics that recycling and organic materials are important to me. I try to buy made in America whenever possible. I know the cotton is all grown here, so if I can buy made in America batting, I know that it's traveled less, that I'm supporting someone who picked the cotton in Texas and milled the cotton in North Carolina. I know that if my back is made in India, the most important thing to me about buying organic cottons is that the people who pick the cottons are not being around the harsh chemicals that are used on cotton. Cotton uses more chemicals on it than any other crop grown in the world. It's also the thirstiest crop grown in the world. So cotton is inherently a highly problematic fiber. And yet we all love it because of the fact that it's comfortable. So recycling, organic, these are sort of the little things that I do, but I don't expect when I sell the quilt to a client that they're buying it for that or that it should matter to them. I want it to be a product that they're happy to bring into their home.
Well, I mean, honestly, sustainability would just be a cherry on top with how beautiful your quilts are. I mean, so what does it mean to you, Richard, to be a modern quilter? What does that mean? Help people sort of connect those dots?
Yeah, my aesthetic sort of developed on its own when I was in school. And then the color palette, honestly, the limits are great for me. It really forces me to focus on structure. But from the very beginning, one of the things I really thought about was the block is important to quilting for portability. When we think back to women in the 17th and 18th centuries, blocks were manageable. Sewing machines were not widely used at that time. Even when sewing machines became available, they were a luxury product. So even in the early 20th century, you know, the women of Gee's Bend, Alabama were oftentimes hand sewing because they didn't have sewing machines. So block size can be a manageable thing. But I really units are necessary. For me, I want to have a unit. I did one quilt once that was a whole cloth and had a bunch of things scattered on it that were appliqué, and it's hard. It's really hard. You have to have a floor that's big enough to accommodate a queen size quilt to work like that. And most of us don't. So thinking about the quilt unit, the question I ask myself is, how can I make a unit that's not a sort of traditional quilt block size? So for missing the point, this quilt, it's all long straight strips. So those are the units, and then they of course stack up to become the whole quilt. For Driven, which was made in Iceland, this quilt, the blocks are sort of not outrageously unusual, but they're rectangular. Quilters, I think, are more accustomed to seeing a square block. And this quilt was fun just because there are 9 different patterns. And a lot of times with triangle quilts, you got one triangle. There's 9 different block styles here. And for me, that goes back to this love of theme and variation in everything I do. I want people to kind of, their eyes to move all over the place, looking for the way that things are the same, but also different.
I think that really shines through with that one, Richard, because like you said, every triangle is different, and it makes you sort of check out each and every single little rectangle that you have in there, because they are very, very slightly different, but enough to make your eye catches it. I love that.
That quilt was tough. All the sides of the triangles are bias. So I had to do a lot of samples on that sucker, because traditional quilt patterns that use triangles usually sew things together in a way that alleviates the trouble of the bias. That whole thing is just bias trouble. It's hard.
Wow. We have another question from Amanda here, who asks, how can another artist find fabrics made in the USA? Is there a certain store that you suggest, or a place where people can start shopping more like you shop, so they can be sustainable artists?
Yeah, it's gotten a lot better. When I started my business proper in 2006, it was incredibly difficult to find organic fabrics made in the USA. There were no colors available. I was actually buying directly from mills, which is something, because of my background, I was able to do, but I think the average person would not be able to pull off. These days, there are a lot more businesses that do sell organic fabrics. Organic Fabric Plus is a great example. They are a distributor that happens to be in Connecticut as well, where the women originally had connected with many of the mills that were in Texas and North Carolina to distribute fabrics. There are more and more brands that are offering color, which is great. There is a company out of California. I'd have to look at my Instagram. I can't remember the name of the brand. I want to say it's like USA made, but there is a brand that makes a line of quilting solids that are entirely milled in the USA. They are not organic, but they are milled here. But by and large, when you buy organic and made in the USA, they tend to be unbleached. You tend to get things that are off-white. Now, I'm obsessed with muslin and off-white colors, but it's not for everybody. So
that's interesting, because we talked about that the other day as well, Richard, is that, cotton is not inherently white, even though that's what a lot of people think of when they think of cotton, that it's naturally more of like an off-white.
And I also think, it's really important that people understand that, because we have limits to what the US is going to be able to do right now in terms of mills and production. So it does not mean that your fabric is bad if it's organic and made in India. Especially considering that cotton is picked by hand in places like India. So when you're buying organic goods, whether or not it's towels or sheets or anything, it means that whoever picked that cotton in India is not having to also maybe grow the food for their family on the same land where the chemicals are being sprayed for the cotton.
Right. We have another question about shopping as well. This one's from Nicole. It says, you talked about thrifting items that are abundant. Is there a specific kind of item or color that isn't abundant and that we should maybe avoid if we're salvaging from a thrift store?
I love that question, because with leather, it's really interesting. Obviously, black and brown are really common for leather. Like, I will go to the thrift store and I will turn down, certain, and I have price limits. Like, if the pants cost more than $10, I won't buy them. But black and brown are really common. Red, remarkably pretty common. Blue leather is incredibly hard for me to find in the open marketplace. And I think because blue leather starts to look more like denim. Gray leather is also really hard, and I love gray leather. But with other things, it's gotten better. Like when I started doing my quilts, blue and white stripes were really common, and it was really hard to find colors. And I do baby quilts that are made using pink and yellow and red. And increasingly, I've noticed, like, I just bought a bunch of green and white striped dress shirts to make a green baby quilt. I love making non-gendered baby goods sell very well for me, and I like making them because then a woman or a man can buy a gift for a baby that maybe isn't born yet. You don't know the gender. Yellow is just happy.
Yeah.
People get tired of pink and blue. It's nice to have green. So I find you have to want to collect. I think that's the answer to the person's question, is that you're not going to be able to go to the thrift store and get all the colors you want in one day. You're going to have to say, I love this pink and white stripe, and you buy that, and then you kind of continue to collect pink and white to build around it. And I love that process. It brings me a lot of joy to collect.
So does that mean you have a closet or multiple closets somewhere just like stacked high with samples that are waiting to be used?
My house is pretty reasonable. If I had to move tomorrow, my house could move. My studio, I have tonnage of fabric. It's embarrassing. I've got a lot of fabric because I also have a wool obsession. So I have yards and yards and yards of vintage wool coatings that I use for things like pillows. So
you're not alone. I don't know any artist who doesn't have a stockpile of whatever their medium is at multiple locations at all times, so don't feel bad. So Richard, you also mentioned that you're inspired by fine art. So, and I know you mentioned Nick Cave in your presentation. Are there any other artists that inspire you? Or if you want to talk a little bit about why Nick Cave inspires you potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nick Cave is, it's about accumulation. The first time I ever saw his work in New York City at a gallery, I realized, like, this is a guy who's collecting stuff, whether or not it's buttons or tin toys or the piece that, it's not his most famous work, but the piece that I was most obsessed with is he did this enormous collage. It was a huge circle of all 1980s beaded dresses. And that style of beaded dress is either for the woman who's going on the cruise or subsequently the drag queen who bought it and performs in it. And I love that. And I know that Nick Cave knows that. So taking apart these beaded dresses and sewing them together. So I love Nick Cave's kind of accumulation thing. Some other artists I'm obsessed with, I don't know how they impact my work, but I'll just throw it out there. I love Alex Prager, the photographer. She's very young. She's out of California. I would say if people have seen her work, it's kind of typified by looking like a woman's perspective via a Hitchcockian lens. Her photographs look very cinematic.
Wow.
I love Marilyn Minter, the painter. She's known for painting mouths and shoes. But I think it's a color sense. I'm really attracted to certain artists that either make me feel something or have a really strong color sense.
Are you drawn to artists who have a similar color sense to you, or do you find that you're really attracted to people who like more audacious colors or very bright or neon?
No, all the artists I like tend to use really obscenely bright colors. I always think of myself as loving bright color and I want to use it in my work. And it's not that I haven't, it's just that I don't very often. I'm trying to see, I might have an image of a quilt here somewhere that I used bright color, or maybe not.
I see in the one behind you, you've got some pinks and reds, which are really popping out.
Oh yeah, I mean, that one has some brighter colors. So that quilt is a quilt that I designed in Iceland using really muted palette. And then I ended up making pillows to match a friend's house in that pattern. And I was like, this would make a great quilt. So the fabric in this kind of warm gray, I found, any of you that know sort of used fabric stores, this was at a fabric store where like all the fabrics were $3 a yard. It's like where fabrics go to die. You know, you have no guarantees you're going to find what you want. You kind of have to sift through it. So it's this warm gray cotton flannel. And then all the strips in it are dress shirts again. So it's red and pink and orange.
Are you finding more availability of color in these dress shirts as you continue shopping into the 21st century?
Sometimes. The quilt that I really wanted to show that I'm not finding easily here is I did a quilt that was all using red. And the woman who hired me to make the quilt, it was for her tween-aged son who was obsessed with Minecraft. And she said he wants a red quilt that says Minecraft. And it was this crazy challenge because I had not played Minecraft. I didn't know what it was. And it ended up being a really fun quilt to make. I'm going to find a picture of it so I can show you.
Did he turn you into a gamer? Are you a Minecraft fiend now, Richard?
Absolutely not.
While you're searching for that, we did get a question about the process. Would you describe your quilting as kind of meditative? Oh, is that the Minecraft?
So this quilt, I think, has 14 different red dress shirts. I didn't have to dye anything for this. There's no company that commercially makes this breadth of red that I needed. It's showing up on my screen slightly maroon or purplish, but it was so red, I had trouble photographing it because it kept blowing out the camera. I mean, it like vibrated. It was so bright and red. And it's such a simple thing. It's just squares. But I think because it's not made using commercial quilting fabrics, it changes the way it looks. Yeah.
That one was beautiful. That was incredible.
What was the question? I missed it. I'm sorry.
We had a question of, would you describe your quilting as kind of meditative? And do you think that that aspect affects your color choices?
I love it when I'm in my studio and 13 hours later, I forget what time it is. That's, I guess, when it's meditative. But, you know, I work, I have other jobs. I think I'm always trying to eke out the time in my studio to do what I want to do. My house is not decorated in neutral tones. My life is not in neutrals. My fashion, I prefer black and black and black and gray, maybe with spikes. So my house, my work, and my fashion don't necessarily always collide. Yeah. So I don't know. The process of the quilting is not necessarily meditative for me, although sewing as a process can be. It's a happy accident that my quilts are really calming, because anyone who knows me knows I'm not a calm person.
No?
I'm a little high energy. Yeah.
So we're almost at that 7 o'clock hour. I've got 2 questions for you before we go, Richard. Or actually, I have 3. My first question for you is actually from Corliss, and it's a little bit more than a question, but she said, thank you to Richard for a fascinating and approachable presentation. I have already followed Ochiltree Design on Instagram. Is there a recycled leather tote bag ready to come into my life?
Oh boy. I have one recycled leather tote bag and some little handbags, kind of like little Fendi baguettes, that are posted to my Etsy. So right now, my link in Ochiltree Design is to this presentation so that all of my friends and family could find it. But I do have an Etsy shop right now. It's Ochiltree Design. And the leather handbags that are available are located there right now. Yes, thank you for asking.
Nice. Do you have any advice that you would pass on to a young or a novice quilter?
Yeah, I loved taking every quilt class I could when I started, because I was overwhelmed by color. I was overwhelmed by the process. You know, I learned applique, I learned hand quilting. I have a very traditional background in quilting, and I feel like I was not able to kind of bust out and break the rules until I started to know what they were. I'm members of quilt organizations that are very traditional. I've taught and done workshops with very traditional things, but when you know the process, then you can know what you want to reject.
That's so interesting. So try everything, experiment.
Yeah. Or, you know, if you're scared of it, just start. Just, you know, get a sewing machine or do it by hand and just start, because it's not going to be wrong. You're making a thing. And if it makes you happy, then you keep doing that.
That is beautiful advice, Richard. And my last question, and one more time, I know you shared it already, but can you tell us where we can find you online, Instagram, Etsy, any of those places where you want people to come?
Sure. Ochiltree Design is the name of my brand that I work under, and that encompasses all of my things. I am on Instagram. I do have a Facebook, which I think, like many people, I'm dubious about whether or not I'm going to continue using it, but I have it. I do have an Etsy shop where I sell small leather goods like zip pouches and purses and things like that. Also, if Ochiltree Design is challenging, if you Google Richard Killeaney, all of my stuff turns up. My last name is unusual enough that you will find me. So it's all there. And I do teach quilt workshops occasionally and dye workshops. So elsewhere, when I'm not quilting, things like this t-shirt, I found the fabric for $2 a yard. It's linen jersey. I dyed it blue and then made the t-shirt. So I do a lot of dye workshops.
Ooh, we'll have to see if we can get you to come down to Pennsylvania and do some of those with us.
That would be great.
So that's the end of our questions for tonight, Richard. But I want to say thank you so, so much for joining us and carving out a little bit of time to share your expertise, your practice, your experience. Like, it's so awesome to be able to hear from an actual artist your experiences.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to have been able to join. I really adore the exhibitions you have up, and so many of those pieces really speak to me. And I think thinking more broadly about what we put on the bed and the value of that and the way that it reflects our culture is so exciting. So yeah, if everyone should check out that exhibition if they haven't made it by.
Thank you. Yes, if you haven't made it by, please do stop by. The exhibition is going to be open until September 12th, both the Roots and the Sleep Tight exhibition. And please don't forget to go check out Richard's work online, support his Etsy shop if you can. And I want to thank all of our visitors who stopped by today to tune in and listen to this fascinating presentation from Richard. I also want to thank everyone who has supported the exhibitions and tonight's events, including the Pennsylvania Museum of Art, the Art Bridges Foundation, and the Berman Foundation. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Richard. I hope you all have a wonderful night and that we see you soon at the Allentown Art Museum.
Excellent. All right. Good night, Abby. Thank you, everybody.
Night.